This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is part of a series generously sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, where we examine democracy, populism, and authoritarianism trends in the region and around the world.
And this week, we're thrilled to have one of the most prominent thinkers about these issues. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She's also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she co-directs ARENA, a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. Anne has been a columnist and a member of the editorial board for The Washington Post, the foreign and deputy editor of The Spectator magazine in London, and she's written, frankly, for all of the top global publications. We can't possibly list them all. She has published 6 books and will be discussing her 7th. It's called The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, published by Penguin Random House in 2020. And she's speaking to us now from the Polish countryside. Anne Applebaum, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
One of the most distinguishing features of the book, in my opinion, is that by contrast to a different kind of genre that's really tried to get into the minds of voters during this phase, especially with relation to American voters, I'm thinking of books like Strangers in Their Own Land or The Hillbilly Elegy. Your book is really about the intellectual, cultural, and media elites, and I'm curious why you chose that approach to address this topic.
Thanks. Yes, that is an important point about the book. It's not an explanation of why people vote for Trump or why lots of people support authoritarianism or other mass movements. It is a book about intellectuals, about journalists, about political strategists, and people who seek to shape authoritarian messages and seek to reach those large numbers of people. And there were a couple reasons why I wrote about them. One is because I know some of them, and some of them I know rather well. And at some point in 2016, 2017, it began to occur to me that I had witnessed something rather interesting, namely a historical moment when people who considered themselves on the center right, some were anti-communists, some were Thatcherites, some were Reaganites, changed and became something different and radicalized and became attracted by the far right. And I felt that this was something that needed explanation. And because I was a witness to it, I could try and have a stab at explaining it. Also because I think it's a group of people whose importance is underrated. People want to talk about Trump or they want to talk about Viktor Orban, and they very rarely want to talk about the people who create the myths, create the propaganda, invent the ideas that keep those people going.
And I wonder if this plays into the rather, I would say, vigorous debate over whether people are drawn to the far right and authoritarianism because they've been economically marginalized and left out, or those who think there's something about the ideology or the political offering that draws people in, the cultural thesis, so to speak. And I'm curious if your choice sort of neutralizes the debate over whether it's really all about people who are economically marginalized, left out of globalization, et cetera.
So I feel that the argument that it's about people who are economically marginalized and left out of globalization has been pretty comprehensively overturned. Lots and lots of middle class and wealthy people voted for Donald Trump and for Brexit. Lots of very poor people voted against Donald Trump and Brexit. And the people who I write about in my book are absolutely not poor and not excluded and not left behind by globalization. They are well educated. They are well traveled. Some of them speak several languages. These are people who are, as worldly as you can imagine. And yet they have been not only attracted to this new radical right, they've become spokespeople for it and promoters of it. And so I am very much an advocate of the idea that although economics explains some things, it really doesn't explain everything. And you have to look at a lot of factors in order to understand why people make the political choices that they do.
So these people that you're talking about were in the same camp as you are and other people who are, say, in the Democratic camp not that long ago. And you describe their transition. And how do you account for it? Is it really an ideological transition, or is it just a cynical Machiavellian sort of transition?
So in the book, I describe different people, and one of the points of the book is that it doesn't have a unifying thesis. I can't give you one answer to that question. Some people are Machiavellian and cynical, and some people are ideological. Some people think they're doing something good for their countries, and they would describe themselves as patriots. I mean, so there's a wide range in the book. I would say that if there's one sentiment that unites everybody, it's probably the sentiment of disappointment. In other words, these are often people who are disappointed with their societies the way that they are. They dislike modern, multicultural, multi-ethnic America, or they feel that modern England is not the influential power that it should be, or they are disappointed by post-1989 Poland, which is somehow not what they imagined it to be. And sometimes that disappointment becomes really extreme to the point of becoming, I use a phrase that was first used by a historian of 19th century Germany, which is the phrase cultural despair. So sometimes it becomes so acute that they are radicalized. I mean, if you think your society is dead or dying or degenerate, then you think it should be smashed up, and you think major changes are needed to fix it. And then sometimes this is coupled with a personal disappointment. I have not achieved what I thought I should achieve. The current elite has not treated me the way I think it should treat me. I don't have the promise that I think I should have. I mean, sometimes there's that element too.
That personal grievance seems to run through a number of the countries that deal with, including sometimes among the very leadership. Leaders, the populist strongman saying, I am the victim of some deep state force. Where does this victimization play into the ideas? And I say ideas because at one point you yourself point out that it's not exactly an ideology. So is it a sort of sense of how people feel about their lives or how their country's going? Can you characterize the ideas that are drawing people in this direction?
So as I said, you start with disappointment. You start with this deep cultural despair. And then you find an explanation for it. Why has this happened? Why has my country degenerated? Why has it declined? Why is it not what it used to be? And you find a scapegoat. And then the scapegoat is the all-powerful elite, or it's the global ruling class, or it's people who went to Ivy League colleges, or it's the European Union. It's some organization which is somehow outside of the natural nation. Some outsiders or foreigners or traitors or people who have betrayed us, and we are the victims of them, even if we are the majority. And even if they are small and weak, we are somehow their victims. And that's the kind of structure of this form of thinking. I'm disappointed. It's someone else's fault, and I am and I am the victim of whatever, whether it's some international conspiracy or a national conspiracy or some social group that has unfairly moved ahead of me. And that's how I explain what it is that's wrong with me. And then and then what we need to do in order to get back to where we used to be. And that's a direct quote from Steve Bannon, back when America was great again, or back when, Hungary was great again. What we need to do is to get rid of those people or those institutions and forge ahead. And you're right. It's not an ideology. It's not a full explanation for the past and the present and the future. It doesn't necessarily have a set of economics that goes along with it. I mean, there's a sort of right-wing economic version of this, and there's a socialist version of this. So it's not about economics. It doesn't offer a vision of the future. It's just it's a way of winning elections, really, and it's a way of organizing people. It's a way of dividing the nation between us and them.
Well, what would you say was the watershed? Because in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, let's discuss, Poland, which is one of the cases that you discuss extensively in the book. These people who have transitioned were the proponents of liberalism, both economic and social. It really worked in their favor in bringing progress and modernism to the country and the EU integration and all those things that greatly benefited Poland and them as their elites. Where did it start going south?
So, of course, as you say, you say correctly that that Poland was a great beneficiary of the fall of communism, that its integration with Europe was one of the great success stories of the last 30 years, that Poland's economic growth and it's certainly at the degree to which it's caught up with the rest of Europe is probably something that's unprecedented in its history. Poland has always been poorer than other parts of Europe to the west, and it's every year it's less true. Nevertheless, there were some people who were not the leaders of that movement and the leaders of that change. They were not part of Solidarity in 1989, or they were lesser or secondary figures. They didn't lead this movement. They aren't the spokespeople for it. And they began to, and they began a counter argument that said that, that used the way of seeing the world I was just describing, which says not only is this not true, not only is Poland not achieved anything, your whatever it is that personally bothers you, to whatever degree you personally have not succeeded, to whatever degree you still feel left behind by the West, or you're angry that that your neighbor makes more money working in Germany, or that your kids have left for London, or you feel some kind of insecurity, we will reflect that insecurity and that grievance. And so what we have now leading the country are people who were not part of that movement, who weren't leaders over the last 30 years, but have sought to hijack the revolution and push it in a different direction.
I want to talk about another point that you make, that these, this emerging class of, I don't know to call them authoritarian or semi-authoritarian powers, don't need to use coercive violence on a mass scale like we saw during the Soviet Union and other regimes. But I want to try to understand how they do their convincing. I mean, we've been talking so far about the draw of this kind of leadership. Is there any coercion on some other level? Specifically, I'm thinking of economic coercion in a situation where you're talking about countries of Eastern Europe that have not really fully made any transition to democracy. They've been on a path since the fall of the Soviet Union, but many of them still suffer from very deeply entrenched party patronage systems that really suffocate political and economic life. And to some extent, is that a form of economic coercion that doesn't entirely exist in the West?
So I actually have a lot of trouble seeing deep differences between Western and Eastern Europe. I know that's unorthodox.
No, that was actually my very next question. Is there a fundamental divide between them?
I don't see it. So, the difference is that in Poland, a political party that the current ruling party that originally portrayed itself as much more moderate than it turned out to be, won an election, and once in power was able to begin making alterations to the system. And that such a party has not yet achieved power in France. But that doesn't mean it can't or it won't. I can imagine an election. I can imagine the next French election. I can imagine Marine Le Pen winning an election and behaving exactly in power as the Law and Justice Party does in Poland. If you look at these kinds of parties, almost everywhere they have a lot in common, whether it's the Vox party in Spain or Marine Le Pen's party in France, which has had a couple of different names, or whether it's the AfD in Germany. They operate in very similar ways. They use similar kinds of messaging. They have similar attitudes. They have similar signs and symbols. I don't think that the fact that that Poland and Hungary, having been unfortunate enough to to have lost election, to have these parties, as their ruling party, is all that fundamentally different. And you can also, by the way, point to other Eastern European countries where they haven't succeeded. So I don't buy that this is the explanation.
To what extent do you think that, especially in Eastern Europe, the contested legacy of the past plays a role? I mean, in Poland, in Hungary, and also in other places.
So the contested legacy of the past is a broad category, and the contested legacy of the past plays a role everywhere.
No, I mean the Second World War and its aftermath.
Oh, I don't think the Second World War is very important at all. I just hate to disappoint you, Israel.
That's absolutely fine.
I mean, the legacy of the piece of the past that matters the most in Poland. I mean, well, there's a degree to which the Second World War matters, but I'll explain in a second. But the piece that matters the most, the biggest historical argument is the one that you brought up a minute ago, which is over what happened after 1989. So was 1989 the beginning of this very slow but ultimately successful movement to integrate Poland with the rest of Europe? Or was it somehow hijacked by former communists and thieves? And, we ordinary people haven't benefited as much as we should have done. And now the EU is trying to take our power away. Those are sort of two different versions of the last 30 years. And that is highly contested, to the degree that Lech Wałęsa, who outside of Poland is acknowledged as certainly the symbol, the father of the anti-communist opposition in Poland, inside the country is no longer recognized by the current government as an important figure at all. They denigrate him. They don't acknowledge him. They undermine him. And really, all the symbols of 1989 and of solidarity, they have seek to erase. From museums to monuments, everything they want it.
Why?
Gone.
Because they weren't anti-communist enough in their view.
There's one version that they weren't anti-communist enough, but I mean mainly because they weren't in charge of it. It was not their revolution, and they think that the current moment is their revolution. Now they're finally running the country. The true Poles, the authentic patriots, are in charge, and now they are taking over, and this is the true revolution. So that's how they would portray the recent past, and that is the most important argument, historical argument that's happening in Poland. I mean, there is an element of the Second World War that they use, namely, there's a feeling of that Poland has always been a victim, that Poland's martyrdom in the Second World War hasn't been widely enough acknowledged, that the outside world misunderstands the history of Poland, and that we are somehow, we are owed things, we haven't been sufficiently compensated. So there's that part of the story is, that in that sense, the Second World War plays a role. I mean, that's incidentally where Israel and to some extent Jews come in, that the international Jewish community doesn't recognize that Poland also, many Poles died during the war, and that Poles did not build Auschwitz, the Germans did. And this is misunderstood by the outside world, and therefore we need special laws to make sure that people understand that. So there's that's an element of it. But by far the most important argument is over the last 30 years. And I would say that's the same is true in Hungary.
But this idea of a national sense of being misunderstood, that we were the actual victims and we deserve more global sympathy, does remind me of some of the processes in the interwar years. And I want to refer back to the work you cite of Karen Stenner. I want to ask, is there any sense of a voter predisposition to authoritarian regimes now that differs from the 30s, or is that whole idea no longer relevant? And in general, are there specific circumstances that relate to now, or are there any political processes that are going on now that reflect something about human nature or democratic society that somehow, has waves of pulling for and against this direction?
So Karen Stenner is a really interesting, kind of behavioral psychologist who's done a lot of work on what makes people instinctively authoritarian. And one of her arguments is that some percentage of any population simply is. And when she says authoritarian, she means she kind of lines up this kind of instinct towards authoritarianism with other traits. And it's often, dislike of diversity and difference. Sometimes it goes hand in hand with racism. She talks about it as a kind of simple-mindedness, people who dislike who dislike debate and argument, who dislike conflict, who are sometimes actually bothered by conflicting arguments and prefer that everyone, be quiet and stay unified, and they just want to hear one message and they want one person in charge. And she does argue that there is a percentage of people like that in every population, and she argues further than that it's up to liberal democracies to find ways to make those people comfortable with liberal democracy, and that those people will always be uncomfortable with it, and some measures have to be made to accommodate this part of the population. I mean, you don't have to believe every piece of that, or you don't have to adhere to whatever it is, the 30% or the 35%, to see that the certain kinds of messages and certain ways of thinking do repeat themselves. I don't really like the direct comparison to the 1930s because, that somehow implies that this will all end in a cataclysmic war and mass murder. And that's not necessarily true.
Not necessarily true. I was hoping you were going to say it's not at all true.
Well, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in 20 years, but yes, I mean, and yes, of course, that element of nostalgia, that element of grievance, that element of that divisive form of politics, the true or authentic people against the inauthentic, foreigners, elites, minorities, outsiders, that way of thinking, of course we recognize it from the 1930s. I mean, that was, again, one of the inspirations for the book was my recognition that the behavior of some of my friends reminded me of the behavior of intellectuals that I'd read described in, there's a famous memoir, Romanian memoir written about the 1930s, in which the author describes how, one by one, his friends start talking about blood and soil and dismiss him as a reader of Proust, and he's trying to understand what happened to them. And something like that happened to me too. So yes, you can make that comparison, but of course, history doesn't really repeat itself. It's just that these same themes do emerge, particularly, I think, at times of rapid change, rapid political change, sociological change, and rapid changes in the information space as well. I mean, I think, we haven't talked about that, but one of the triggers clearly for the current change is the move of debate and discussion online, which I think has had really profound effects on people.
You say also that many of these new intellectuals of the radical right were once upon a time your friends and people that you saw eye to eye with, and you don't anymore, and many of them don't even speak to you. I was wondering whether, other than, thinking or maybe analyzing these processes that they've undergone, have you tried to, maybe sit down with one of them, reach out to them and try and get maybe a logical, cerebral explanation from one of them, one that you found to a certain degree convincing?
So if you read the book, you'll know that I did try with several people. I called them. There was one person did agree to talk to me. This is Maria Schmidt, who's one of Viktor Orban's ideologists. And I did go and see her, and she, I wouldn't say it was an honest and open conversation, actually, unfortunately. I mean, she sort of spouted propaganda at me. So no, that wasn't successful. I should say that there's an exception I do write about the UK in this book, and I write about Brexit because it does have some things in common with these other movements. But I do have lots of friends who are Brexiteers or who voted for Brexit anyway. And so that I have, in that sphere, I have found it possible to stay friends with people. And I think I probably also have some friends who are still Republicans. In fact, I certainly do. So it's not as if, I can't speak to anybody. But it is true that the more ideological and the more radical people have become, and in some, the more difficult it is to speak to them from the perspective of, from a different perspective.
Or from any perspective, when one of your friends said, I don't think we would have anything to talk about. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, some of them didn't want to talk to me. I mean, remember that, and I explained this in the book as well. Certainly in Poland, I mean, this isn't true in other countries, but in Poland, it's everything is a little more fraught because my husband is a politician, and therefore we are somehow figures in the, actors in the political debate. I'm not an observer; I'm a player. And so some of people's attitudes to me are connected to him or to his party. So that's an added element that makes it difficult. In principle, I would be very happy to talk to some of them if it would be fruitful conversation. But as I said, it's it's not interesting to them.
Right. I mean, we have not so much time left, but tons of questions left. I still want to ask you, I want to go back to something you mentioned before about the technological changes. And, that's something we've all been thinking about. We've interviewed a number of wonderful experts on the show on that issue. And my question to you is, do you think that this sense of, a complete sort of revolution in information and the sense of growing complexity in the world, which you also write about, is that really so different now, or does it mirror major technological ruptures in earlier stages of development in human life?
Well, so I make exactly that argument in the book. I say that I point out, and it's not at all original to me, that every time there has been a major change in information technology, whether it's the invention of the printing press or the invention of the radio, there have been big political changes that have gone along with it. The two people who really understood the radio at the beginning and how radical it was were Hitler and Stalin. I mean, there's no question that both of them understood how to use it in, how to talking to people in their houses, how that could be used in new ways. So there's nothing at all new about information change bringing about political change. Usually people ask me a different question, namely, does it really matter, this information change? We had polarization before and we had people watching different television programs. I really do think it does matter. First of all, the degree to which you can now be surrounded by messages, the amount of time that people spend on their phones or online, and the way in which you can be inundated all the time with political messaging or forms of political messaging, or bias confirmation or stories that agree with agree with what you already think. It's just a kind of qualitative difference between, it's not like you're just reading the newspaper once in the morning or watching a television show once a night. You can literally be absorbed in this stuff 24 hours a day, in any political issue. I also think that social media and the sort of performative element of it and the way in which people are, all of us do this now, in which you are acting online and in which you say things in order to get likes or in order to people are simply communicating in different ways. And there are all kind of evidence that social media makes people more aggressive, particularly people who are anonymous. We all know, I won't repeat this, I'm sure your listeners know that the algorithms on social media are designed to accelerate and spread emotion, anger, hatred, and they simply do that more efficiently than they spread constructive conversation. So I do think that the nature of social media has accelerated a lot of other things.
Right. I mean, I guess my question was not so much, I remember you made the point in the book about this not being a new phenomenon, that there's a major technological change and political upheaval. But I guess I just hear all the time people referring to the current age as something completely different. And I suppose you're saying the answer is that there is a substantive difference in terms of the nature of the current technology, but the process of political upheaval related to it is something we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, no, human nature hasn't changed in any fundamental way. And the kinds of things that make people angry and divided, aren't that different now from what they were 100 years ago. But I do think that the nature of social media has accelerated certain processes just because it's so all absorbing and it simply speeds up. I mean, certainly the speed with which conspiracy theories and disinformation can now be spread is like nothing before in human history.
And even though Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and America are really your field of expertise, you're also sitting on the international board of the Israel Democracy Institute, which is one of the biggest think tanks in Israel and a trusted partner of the Tel Aviv Review podcast as well.
A beloved partner.
Absolutely. Have you reflected at all on what's going on in Israel in relation to the trends that you describe in your book?
I have. I mean, I should say that I'm not an expert in Israeli politics, and I'm on that board, I think, for my expertise in foreign countries rather than my expertise in Israel, if that makes sense. I mean, I can't compete with those, they're great thinkers in their analysis of Israel. I mean, but, it's not a very, to see that Netanyahu uses and has used in the past some of these same kinds of tactics, this divisive attack on elites, even more so. I mean, the piece of Israeli politics that I still can't really get over, it's still astonishing to me, is the support that Netanyahu has shown for ethnic nationalists in Europe, and in particular, Viktor Orban. He's made a point. He's gone out of his way to talk about Orban as a true friend of Israel. He has, appeared in public with him. He openly supports him. They talk about one another. I mean, Viktor Orban is really the only European leader, I'd say, since the Second World War, who has used openly anti-Semitic language in politics, I guess it's that for Netanyahu, the fate of Jews in Hungary doesn't bother him, or it's because the ethnic nationalism of Hungary, which, by the way, the Hungarians are fine with Jews as long as they're in Israel. I mean, that's the, maybe that's fine with him. Maybe it's the ethnic nationalism. Maybe it's the type of politics. Maybe it's the anti-European, anti-European Union politics. Maybe it's that they both dislike George Soros. I mean, there are many things they have in common. Nevertheless, if you step back from it, it is quite shocking to have an Israeli leader openly endorsing, I would say, an anti-Semitic European leader.
Or could it be because he likes to surround himself with other illiberal leaders and thereby legitimize the illiberal trends going on domestically in Israeli life?
Sure. I mean, and that's why Orban wants to be associated with Netanyahu. I mean, of course, so there are many of these leaders seek the company of one another. All of them have the problem of being isolated internationally. And so they're constantly looking for friends who they can show up with and, hold hands with and have their photographs taken with. And so, yes, I mean, if Netanyahu needs to show he has friends in Europe and he's got friends in Hungary, and then I'm sure it's, he sees that as positive. But it is still, as I say, when you can find explanations for it, sort of rational reasons why it's happening, and yet when you step back from it, it's still very strange.
I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the broader slide away from into illiberal democracy among some of these countries and the global stage. Just looking at some of the recent work you've written in The Atlantic following, now that we're nearing a post-Trump era. But you point out in one article that we will, and I quote, never go back to normal because you've observed that some of the international structures that have been built in the post-war system haven't really managed to hold back that slide. So I'm curious what you think could change on the international stage that might help, create some sort of a stronger basis for supporting democracies in the future.
So I didn't mean to suggest by that article that Biden won't matter. I think Biden can do quite a lot. The main thing that democracies need is to really carry out some joint projects together. What I worried about in the article was some kind of, there's a big meeting and Biden gets together with, I don't know, Angela Merkel and the rest of the gang, and everybody says we all love each other, and they, have a grand dinner, and then they all go home. And that if that's what happens, it's a disaster. But there are some concrete projects that the world's democracies could do together. I mean, one of them, for example, is finding better ways to regulate the internet, by which I don't mean censor the internet. I mean thinking more deeply about how to make the internet more conducive to democracy, better for democracy, how to make sure that it's promoting constructive conversation, that it's not dominated by 2 or 3 companies in Silicon Valley. That it's anonymous trolls and bot farms aren't able to direct conversation in the way that they do now, and that's a huge project. Thinking about what that should be. I mean, we know what the authoritarian internet looks like. That's what China has created. So what do we want? And how, if we were starting from scratch, how would we structure the internet? How would we structure social media so that it's good for us and good for our political systems? That's something democracies could work on together. The second really big project is, what are we going to do about dark money, money laundering, the corrupt money coming from Russia and China, which is often, the politically charged investments that are made in all of our countries. The attempt to manipulate our politics from the outside. How are we going to fight that and combat that? That's another big project that democracies could do together, and that solving that problem would strengthen them. I mean, there are other projects too. I mean, obviously, climate change is a project that we can all work on together. There's clearly, there's an ongoing public health crisis, and finding solutions to that is something we can do together. But the 2 things in particular that I think would be most significant for the future of democracy, as I say, are talking in a very deep way about the rules that govern online communication, and also talking in a very deep way about the world of dark money.
Well, we always like to be forward-looking, so I want to thank you again, Anne Applebaum, for being on this show and talking about your new book, Twilight of Democracy. Thank you again for speaking with us.
No, thanks for having me.
And thank you to Itai Shelem, our producer, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their partnership with this series. Now, a request: many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You can also support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 600 interviews. And you can like us on Facebook. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review next week. And until then, goodbye.